Hi everyone, today we'll be analysing War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. Some of the key themes we will be looking at are victims of conflict, war zone versus rural England, corruption of power, and appearance versus reality. Okay, let's get started. Now, as always, we will be using the 4-step approach to recap on key analysis points. This will be looking at the significance of the title, structural techniques, language techniques, and shift in tone. For more information on this, make sure to check out my video on how to analyse any poem, which I will link below. Also make sure to hang around till the end to see what poems we can compare War Photographer to. In Duffy's poem, the title functions to simply but boldly highlight the role of war photographers and the weight of their responsibilities, as well as what they witness when doing their job. Furthermore, the lack of name or identity suggests that this poem represents anyone in this role, otherwise implying that all war photographers share the same similar traumatic experience of isolation and emotional conflict. Now let's take a look at the structural techniques. Firstly, for the main body of the stanza, it is made up of 4 stanzas, with a rhyming couplet at the end of each stanza, but otherwise no rhyming lines. Also, each stanza is composed of 6 lines, a very rigid and controlled structure. This is how the physical shape of the poem mirrors the detached and controlled approach war photographers must take on as part of their role. They must only follow the order of capturing pictures of people suffering at war and neglect their own trauma, hence the stanzas imposing order and control in the chaos of emotion and war. You could also argue that the rhyming couplet at the end subtly suggests that the narrator is indicating that no matter how much a war photographer tries to stay within the strict order they've been given, they cannot help slipping into the emotional trauma of everything that they witness. Okay, now we also see that there is a contrast in setting between the stanzas. In stanza 1, the war photographer is in his darkroom developing photos. Stanza 2 to 3 illustrate the memories of war zones and suffering. Finally, in stanza 4, it depicts the war photographer's return to normal life, where people are indifferent to war. It is only a temporary suffering that they feel. This, of course, contrasts the reality of physical and emotional suffering of those who are actually at the war zone, which the reader was exposed to in the previous 2 stanzas. Therefore, this is an effective structural technique which illustrates to the reader the intimate and traumatic journey a war photographer has. It is almost depicting the struggle of war photographers being aware of both sides, the war and the calm. The final stanza is important because it carries a tone of isolation, reflecting the distance between those who experience war firsthand and those who only see it through the media or otherwise the narrator's photographs. It's also worth noting the cyclical structure, with the poem's start and end consisting of the photographer's detached and emotionless routine. We can see the structure emphasized in the line, "From the airplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living and they do not care." The fact that he takes the photos, people briefly notice them, but nothing changes, reinforces this theme of futility of war and also allows the reader to question that, although his work exposes suffering, does it really make a difference? Now let's move on to some of the key language techniques. Duffy uses imagery which creates a semantic field of suffering and death. For instance, the quote, "spools of suffering set out in ordered rows," uses sibilance and vivid imagery to suggest endless human pain, neatly arranged like graves in a war cemetery. This immediately intrigues the reader. The narrator goes on to describe the dark atmosphere in his room. Although red, the softly glowing light suggests a chamber of safety and reflection for the photographer. Juxtaposition is also used throughout the poem. Some examples of this include the religious imagery used in the first stanza. The mentioning of the church and then the war zones being listed after re-emphasizes this contrast between settings of peace and war. Also, the mentioning of the priest compares the photographer's work to a sacred duty, making him seem like a solemn and isolated figure who is to witness everyone suffering. Now, this sense of duty is also furthered through the use of the short sentence, "he has a job to do." The blunt sentence here portrays the photographer to be suppressing his emotions, reflecting his professional detachment and emotional burden. A second example is the line, "fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat." This juxtaposes the safe and peaceful Western world with the horrors of the war zone which the war photographer gets a glimpse of. It also forces the readers to recognise their own privileged detachment. The third stanza opens with a short sentence, "Something is happening." The use of the short sentence and caesura shifts the tone. Significantly, this moment acts as a turning point in the poem, shifting the wall photographer's controlled process of developing photos to an emotional reaction. Also, the use of enjambment in the third stanza shows how the flow of lines without any pause mimics the photographer's flood of traumatic memories, showing how this emotion cannot be contained. You could also argue that this reflects the narrator's own struggle to escape his trauma as a war photographer. The last stanza opens with a metaphor, which depicts the war photographer's photos as agonies. So, this conveys them to be more than just photos, they represent a real sense of suffering. This suggests the photographs capture deep human pain, but the phrase black and white also hints at how they are emotionally flattened for news consumption. It also indicates Gothic and sensory imagery to describe the atmosphere of war. We can also see Gothic language being hinted at in other areas of the poem, like the phrase half-formed ghost in the third stanza. Finally, the last line of the stanza, "They do not care," causes the reader to question who they are. This open-ended conclusion to the poem is powerful as it reinforces the theme of society's indifference to the suffering of people at war. Another important note is that the narrator, who, as we've established, is a war photographer, does not associate himself with them. This is how he communicates to the reader that despite his role and unlike the others, he is very sympathetic and emotionally impacted by the photographs and more so the war scenes that he has seen. Now let's look at shift in tone. One of the most powerful aspects of war photographer is the shift in tone, as it plays a great role in mirroring the photographer's emotional journey. At the start, the tone is calm and controlled, reflecting the ordered environment of his dark room, where he's trying to maintain a sense of professionalism, and it also seems very detached. This effectively is exemplified in the line, "In his dark room, he's finally alone." However, as the poem progresses, the tone becomes more emotional and reflective, particularly as he recalls the horrors he has witnessed. Phrases like "a half-formed ghost" and "he remembers the cries" introduce a tone of trauma and sorrow. This lets the reader know how the pain he captured in his photos lingers with him constantly, even when he leaves the war zone. Finally, the tone shifts again in the last stanza to something more detached and bitter. As the photographer returns to work, he makes it clear that he knows his photographs will only provoke 100 agonies in black and white, and that readers will quickly forget. This tonal progression highlights the emotional burden carried by those who document conflict and the indifference of the wider society. In other words, Duffy is able to highlight the weight of the responsibility which war photographers have, whilst also emphasising the horrific and dismissive attitude that rural England have towards those who are actually suffering in the war. Now let's take a quick look at some poems which we could compare war photographer to in the Power and Conflict collection. The first poem we could potentially compare war photographer to is Remains by Simon Armitage. This is because both poems display a sense of internal conflict and are both very personal accounts. Another significance between them is that they both share a very emotional connection to their encounter with conflict and war, despite both narrators' attempts to emotionally detach and distance themselves, sticking to their duty. A second poem which would be great to compare to War Photographer is Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Both War Photographer and Exposure present the reality of war. They also specifically highlight the dismissive nature of people at home. Although both poems offer the difference in perspective, as one acts an observer and the other one is actively a soldier in the battlefield, they both have a cyclical structure reflecting the vicious cycle of war and suffering. Make sure to keep looking for more language and structural techniques to practice your analysis, and of course keep an eye out for any more poems that you could compare War Photographer to. I'd love to hear what you find in the comments below. As always, thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video.